Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight, we're about to dive into a tale from a time long past, where alchemy, mystery, and the sea all weave together in a way that may seem familiar, but is anything but. Picture this: a quiet coastal village nestled against the cliffs of a dark and winding shore, far from the noisy, bustling towns of the mainland. Elaria is a place where the pace of life is as slow as the rhythm of the waves. But beneath this serene surface, there's something a little different about the villagers, and about one particular man who lives among them. You see, Ilaria's salt collector is no ordinary man. His work seems humble, just a daily grind of harvesting salt from caves deep beneath the sea. But the truth is far more complex than anyone realizes. This is a man who knows the secrets of the elements, secrets that have been passed down from time immemorial. Little do the villagers know, his role in their lives is about to change forever. You probably want to know more about this man, who he is, what he's really up to in those shadowy caves. But first, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt a pull towards something? A quiet, inexplicable draw that makes you feel like you're in the right place at the right time, even if you don't fully understand why? Well, that's where our story begins, beneath the waves, where the salt flows and the secrets rise. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Let's share that sense of moment before we go any further. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The salt collector of Elaria had never been a man of many words. His presence was quiet, his movements deliberate. He woke early each morning when the sky was still a faint shade of grey, and made his way to the cave entrances that dotted the cliffs near the edge of the village. Here, in these hidden caverns, the sea whispered to him, if you listened closely enough. The caves themselves were not special to most who lived nearby. They were just part of the landscape, natural wonders the villagers had used for centuries, harvesting the salt that came from the deep sea water. To them, the salt was vital, a staple in their food and medicine, yet they knew little of the mysteries that lay beneath. For the salt collector, these caves were home. This was where he felt a peculiar sense of peace, where the world outside seemed far away, and where his alchemical studies could take on a life of their own. You see, the salt he collected was not like the ordinary salt you might use at dinner. No, this was something far more potent, a special variety known to few. It came from the minerals found in the deepest reaches of the caves, where the sea touched the earth in ways that hadn't been understood for centuries. Though the salt collector had never shared his knowledge with anyone, there were rumors. Whispers floated among the villagers that his salt had some kind of healing power, that it could cure ailments no doctor's medicine could. Some said he had learned the ways of the ancients. Others claimed he had made deals with the sea itself. Yet, the truth was simpler. The collector knew that his salt was not merely a mineral. It was a conduit, a medium for something far older. And every day, as he harvested it, he felt it growing stronger, felt a presence growing beneath the surface, beneath the ocean. Some days the whispering began faintly, almost imperceptible. He had always heard the sea's calls. Who didn't? But now, it felt as though the salt itself was trying to communicate. At first, it was like a faint hum, just a trick of the wind, surely. But over time, as he distilled the salt in his small laboratory, something curious happened. The whispers became words. There were no voices, not in the way one might expect. It wasn't a human voice. It was more like a suggestion, a tickle in the back of the mind, a gentle nudge. The first time it happened, the salt collector almost ignored it. He thought perhaps it was exhaustion after a long day of work, but the whispers kept returning. They had a rhythm, an almost hypnotic cadence, and it was as though they were calling him. "Use me wisely," the whispers said. Or perhaps it was more like a thought he could not dismiss. "I can heal, but what you ask will come at a price." The salt collector could not explain it. The salt, the whispers, they all seemed to tug at something deep inside him, something he had long buried. The knowledge he had gained through years of alchemy, through hours of study and careful practice, was suddenly connected to something greater, something that had been hidden away beneath the waves for centuries. He wondered, had the sea always whispered, and he had simply never heard it? Or had the salt itself changed, grown more sentient with each passing harvest? As days turned to weeks, the salt collector's routine remained the same. He spent long hours in the caves, carefully extracting the mineral, then distilling it into something far more potent. Every now and then, he would pause, listening to the subtle sounds around him. Sometimes the wind whistled, sometimes the sea roared louder than usual, but there were moments, just moments, when the world seemed to quiet, and the only sound was the whisper of the salt. The villagers, for the most part, were oblivious to the salt collector's growing obsession. They came to him, as they always had, to purchase the salt they needed. They never saw the strange gleam in his eye, never noticed the slight tremor in his hands when he passed the bags of salt over, and they certainly never realized the salt was beginning to do something more than simply cure their ailments. But to the collector, it was becoming clear. There was something in the salt, something alive. The salt collector of Elaria did not seek fame, nor did he desire the admiration of his fellow villagers. In truth, he preferred the quiet isolation of his work, spending long hours in the caves, harvesting salt from the sea's deep caverns, and experimenting with its strange, growing power. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift in the village. Whispers, faint at first, began to spread. The village had always been small, its population made up of simple folk who lived close to nature. They tended their crops, fished the waters, and made do with what the earth provided. But lately, something had changed. Strange ailments began to afflict the villagers. People who had once been healthy started to suffer from mysterious, lingering illnesses that no one could explain. Their skin grew pale and sallow, their bones ached as though they had lived 100 years, and a strange lethargy clouded their minds. No healer could identify the cause of the sickness. All the village's remedies, herbs and poultices, concoctions of local plants, proved useless. And the town doctor, a man who had studied medicine for years in distant lands, could not offer any relief. The villagers grew desperate. It wasn't long before the first whispers of the salt collector's unusual abilities started to reach the ears of the afflicted. "He's got something," they said, "something that can help." At first, these murmurs were little more than idle gossip. The salt collector had always been a reclusive figure, and his strange work in the caves was known to few. Most of the villagers considered him odd but harmless. Still, the word spread. When the first person came to him, a woman named Agnes, whose body had grown frail and weak from an unknown affliction, the salt collector hesitated. He wasn't sure whether he was truly equipped to help, especially with the salt's mysterious qualities. But the desperation in her eyes, the haunting weakness in her voice, made him act. He gave her a small pouch of the salt, instructing her to dissolve it in water and bathe with it every evening. She thanked him profusely, but the salt collector could not shake the feeling that something was beginning to shift. As he watched her leave, a flicker of unease washed over him. The salt whispered to him again, an unspoken warning, or perhaps a promise of things to come. Days passed before Agnes returned, and when she did, it was with surprising news. The salt had worked. She no longer felt the crushing fatigue that had weighed on her for months. Her skin was no longer pale and sallow, and her bones no longer ached. She was, in her own words, alive again. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved me. The salt, it's miraculous." For a brief moment, the salt collector felt a rush of pride, but the whispering salt never let him forget the price of such healing. The salt had worked, yes, but there was something unsettling about how it seemed to respond to the villagers' needs. It wasn't just a simple mineral, was it? No, it was something more. It had a mind of its own. As the days wore on, more villagers came to him. Word spread like wildfire, and the once reclusive salt collector became the village's unlikely hero. They came with ailments both large and small, fevers, rashes, chronic pains, and those whose lives had been slowly slipping away in the face of mysterious maladies. The salt worked every time. The collector's hands, once steady but unremarkable, now handled the precious substance with the care and reverence of someone who knew its true power. Each time, the salt whispered louder. He gave them all the salt they asked for. He didn't think about the cost, at least not at first. People were healed. That was enough. But what was the cost? Though the villagers were grateful, and though the salt collector saw their health restored with each new use, there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. The salt wasn't simply curing physical ailments, it was changing them, altering their bodies and minds in ways that he couldn't fully explain. Each healing came with an unspoken debt, though he couldn't tell whether it was a debt to the sea, to the salt, or to something far older and more dangerous. The whispers grew ever more insistent, a constant presence in his mind. He found himself working later and later in the caves. He began to experiment with different methods of distillation, seeking a more potent version of the salt. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, but he knew the salt held the answer. There were nights when he thought he heard the salt whisper his name, soft and insistent, as though beckoning him to listen, to understand. His obsession grew. The whispers, once a faint suggestion, now called to him in a language he couldn't understand. The more he listened, the more he felt an unfamiliar pull, an intoxicating desire to delve deeper, to uncover the salt's secrets, and to push its healing properties to their limits. It was a dangerous path. The salt was a gift, yes, but what came with it? What did the salt want from him? The village continued to flourish. As long as the salt collector could keep supplying the villagers with the salt they needed, they thrived. But there were subtle changes, a touch of greed in their eyes, a quiet desperation to get more, to be healed completely, to never suffer again. The salt collector knew it wasn't healthy. He could sense that something was wrong, but the villagers did not notice, at least not yet. Then, one morning, a man arrived from the village's neighboring town. He had heard the rumors of the miraculous salt, of the healer living in the caves by the sea. His sister had been bedridden for months with a crippling illness, and he came seeking help, desperate for a cure. The salt collector knew this would be different. There was a certain urgency in the man's eyes that set his heart racing, but it wasn't the usual kind of desperation. It felt darker, more insistent. The man's sister needed healing, yes, but could she handle the price? The salt whispered to him again. The man's arrival in Elaria marked the beginning of a new chapter for the salt collector, though he didn't yet realize how much his life and the lives of the villagers was about to change. The man, whose name was Aemon, was tall and broad-shouldered, but there was a nervousness about him that made him stand out. His eyes darted constantly, as if he were afraid that someone might see into his thoughts. He made his way to the salt collector's humble dwelling, a cottage on the edge of the village, its windows always closed tight as if to keep out the light of day. Aemon came bearing a heavy burden. His sister Leora had been ill for months, wasting away from a fever that no doctor could explain. He had tried every remedy, every potion, every prayer, and yet she remained as sick as the day it started. He'd heard of the miraculous salt, he had heard of the healer, and he was willing to do anything at all, to save her. The salt collector greeted him with his usual quiet composure, though something in Aemon's voice told him this was no ordinary request. The man was desperate. The salt collector had seen desperation before, but this was different. The salt's whispers in his mind grew louder as Aemon spoke, urging him to listen closely. "I sit'll pay anything," Aemon said, his voice shaking. "I sit'll give you all I have. I just need my sister to be well again." The salt collector studied him carefully. Something about the man's urgency unsettled him. He'd helped many over the years, but something told him this was not just a simple request. There was more at play here, something beneath the surface, something hidden in Aemon's words. The whispering salt only added to the unease, and the collector could not shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something he did not understand. "I can help," the salt collector said, his voice low, "but you need to understand, the salt I give is not just a cure, it is a power, a force that carries a price that you may not be willing to pay." Aemon hesitated, and the salt collector could see that he was torn. He wanted to believe in the salt's power, but he was also clearly afraid of what it might mean. Still, desperation had a way of pushing people past their doubts, past their fears. "I don't care what the price is," Aemon said, his words urgent. "I will do anything. Just save my sister." The salt collector took a slow breath. He could feel the pull of the salt growing stronger now, the whispers almost commanding. He had never heard them so clearly, so insistent. It was as if the salt itself was guiding him, pushing him to offer more than he had before. "I will give you what you need," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But once you accept, there is no turning back. You must promise me that you will do whatever it takes to honor the salt. Do you understand?" Eamon nodded eagerly. "Yes, yes, I understand." With that, the salt collector led him to the small room in the back of his cottage, where he kept his alchemical tools. The room was filled with strange glowing bottles and vials of various colors, each containing something different, something potent. But it was the salt that had always been the center of his work. It was what had kept the village healthy, it was what had drawn the whispers of the deep sea, and it was what had begun to change him. The collector retrieved a small pouch of salt, its contents shimmering with an otherworldly glow. As he handed it to Eamon, the man's eyes widened, as if he had just received something of untold value. "Use it as I instructed," the collector said, though a part of him couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. "Prepare a bath for your sister. Let her soak in it. But remember, the salt heals, but it also changes. It will fix what sips broken, but it will not leave you the same." Eamon took the pouch with trembling hands, his face a mix of hope and fear. He didn't seem to understand the full weight of the salt collector's words. All he saw was the promise of healing, the possibility of saving his sister. He left quickly, the pouch clutched tightly in his hand. As the salt collector returned to his work, the whispers in his mind grew louder, more urgent. It was as if the salt knew something he did not. There was an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach, one that had been growing for weeks. The power he had uncovered was not merely a gift, it was a force, one that could bend lives and minds to its will. The night passed slowly. The salt collector worked in his lab, mixing various concoctions, but his thoughts kept returning to Eamon and his sister. Had he made a mistake? Had he given the salt to someone who was not ready for its power? Then, at dawn, the answer came. Eamon returned, his face pale, his expression one of horror. "She sip's gone," he said, his voice trembling. "She sip's dead." The salt collector Seardaba's heart sank. "Hot? What happened?" She bathed in the salt, just as you said, and for a moment I thought it was working. But then something changed. Her skin turned pale, and her eyes, they were different. They were not hers anymore. She didn't speak, she just stared at me, and then she collapsed." Eamon Sit's voice cracked with despair. "I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" The salt collector stood still, his mind racing. He had seen the power of the salt, yes, but this was something he had not expected. The whispers grew more insistent now, almost as though they were mocking him. The salt had healed, yes, but it had come at a cost that neither of them could have anticipated. The salt collector stood motionless, Eamon's grief-stricken words echoing in his mind. He could see the man's trembling hands, the vacant look in his eyes as he struggled to comprehend the tragedy that had unfolded. It was the moment the collector had feared, the moment he had been dreading deep within his soul. The salt, the very thing he had believed to be a healing gift, had taken a life instead of saving it. "She wasn't meant to die," Eamon said, his voice barely more than a whisper. His hands shook as he gripped the pouch of salt that the collector had given him, the once glowing crystals now dull and lifeless in his grasp. "I thought it would work, just like it did for the others." The salt collector's heart clenched as he looked down at the pouch, then back at Eamon. He could see the despair etched into the man's features, the raw pain of loss. It was the kind of grief that no one could truly prepare for. And yet, deep down, the collector understood. The salt had promised something greater. It had promised a cure, but it had also demanded something in return, something that neither Eamon nor the salt collector had fully understood. "Eamon," the collector said slowly, his voice almost apologetic, "the salt, it is not just a cure, it accepts more than that. It has a consciousness, a will of its own, and when you use it, you are not just asking it to heal, you are bargaining with it, whether you realize it or not." Eamon Sit's eyes flickered with confusion. "Bargaining with it? What do you mean?" The salt collector swallowed hard, knowing that what he was about to say would sound absurd to a man who was already on the edge of reason, but he had to speak the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. "The salt, it has a voice. It's been speaking to me, telling me things I don't understand. It offers healing, yes, but it also demands something in return. It is not a simple substance. It is ancient, something older than the world itself. When you ask for its power, it always takes something. Kasemted me, Aemon sits, face twisted in disbelief. You knew this would happen. The salt collector didn't answer right away. How could he? How could he explain the whispers that had grown louder, the sense of inevitability that had crept into his thoughts? He had always known there was a cost. He had sensed it, but had he truly understood the extent of the price? No, he had underestimated it. And now, Aemon's sister was gone, taken by the very thing that was meant to heal her. The room was filled with a heavy silence, the weight of guilt and regret hanging between them like a thick fog. The salt collector's mind raced. How could he have been so careless? How could he have allowed himself to be swept up in the salt's promises of healing? Had he truly thought it would never ask for anything in return? No, Aemon said suddenly, his voice hardening. This isn't your fault. I asked for it. I asked for the salt, and I should have known there was a cost. He looked down at the pouch again, his expression one of disbelief. But I didn't understand. I didn't know it would cost my sister's life. The salt collector closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to clear his mind, trying to find a way to make sense of what had just happened. There was a sickening realization settling over him. The salt had claimed a life he hadn't intended to sacrifice. And yet, in a strange way, he understood. The salt did not act out of malice. It was simply fulfilling its own nature, just as it had done for centuries, maybe even millennia. It healed, yes, but it also took, always taking in exchange for the gift it offered. "I'm sorry, Aemon," the collector said softly, his voice thick with regret. "I did not understand fully either. The salt is not a simple cure. It stumps, ancient, powerful, and it has a will of its own. I didn't think it would claim your sister. I didn't think it would demand her life." Aemon stood there, trembling, his face a mixture of disbelief and anguish. "So what do we do now?" His voice cracked with emotion. "How do I fix this? How do I bring her back?" The salt collector's heart broke as he saw the raw pain in Aemon's eyes. He wished there was something he could say, something he could do to undo what had been done. But deep down he knew that it was too late. The salt had already taken its price, and nothing could bring back what had been lost. "There sips nothing we can do," the collector said quietly. "Once the salt takes, it doesn't give back. It sips too late." For a long moment the two men stood in silence, the gravity of the situation settling over them both. The salt collector could feel the weight of his own complicity in this tragedy. He had been the one to give Aemon the salt. He had been the one to offer the healing without fully understanding the cost. And now there was no turning back. But as the silence stretched on, a thought crept into the collector's mind, one that he had tried to push away for weeks. The salt had always whispered to him, urging him to use it in greater quantities, to push its limits. He had always resisted, fearing the consequences. But now, in this moment of loss, he wondered if he had been wrong to hesitate. What if there was another way? What if the salt could be used to undo what had been done? What if it could bring Aemon's sister back, if only he was willing to pay the price? It was a dangerous thought, a tempting thought. But the salt had taken life before. Could it also give life back? The whispering grew louder in his mind, as if the salt itself was answering him. "Ask," it said, "and I will give." But the collector's heart was heavy with the knowledge of what that would mean. The salt would give, yes, but at what cost? "Maybe," the salt collector said slowly, more to himself than to Aemon, "there is a way to fix this, but it will come at a price we might not be willing to pay." Aemon looked at him, his eyes wild with a mix of hope and desperation. "What price?" The salt collector met his gaze. "The salt will always demand something, and I don't know if either of us is prepared for what it will take." The room grew colder, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Both men stood on the precipice of something they could not understand, caught between hope and terror. The whispering grew louder, as though the salt itself was trying to force its way into the collector's mind, urging him to make a choice. The thought that had begun as a fleeting curiosity now held him captive. Could the salt truly bring life back from death? Could it undo the price it had already demanded? The question gnawed at him like a persistent, uninvited guest, impossible to ignore. The silence between the salt collector and Eamon stretched, both men caught in a tangled web of grief, desire, and something far more dangerous. Eamon's face was a mix of desperation and disbelief, his hands trembling as he clutched the empty pouch of salt. The collector could see the raw, desperate need in his eyes. He had already lost everything, and now he was willing to risk even more to retrieve what had been taken from him. For the first time, the salt collector began to wonder if his long-held knowledge, his carefully maintained distance from the true power of the salt, had been a mistake. Perhaps it was time to embrace what the salt was offering, to use it for a purpose far greater than just simple healing. The salt had already taken, but could it be persuaded to give back? Could he bargain with it, or would he be consumed by it entirely? Eamon, the collector said slowly, his voice quiet but tinged with a strange resolve. I can try, but understand this. Whatever I do, it will not be without consequence. We're not just using the salt anymore. We're asking it to defy its own nature, and there's no telling what the cost will be. Eamon Sept's eyes widened as he processed the salt collector Sept's words. I don't care about the cost anymore. I need my sister back. I I'll pay whatever price it asks. I'll do anything. The collector hesitated. He had known, deep down, that this was where it would lead. When people became desperate enough, they would sacrifice anything, even their souls, to get what they wanted. The salt had already claimed one life. Now it seemed that it was willing to claim more. The collector knew that this path would not end well, but he also knew that once you entered into a bargain with the salt, there was no turning back. He glanced at the pouch, now dull and lifeless in Eamon's hand. The salt, once bright and shimmering, now seemed drained of all its power, but there was something in the air, a palpable sense that the salt's influence had not waned completely. The salt's whispering, which had been so insistent in the past, had fallen quiet, almost as though it was waiting. I will need more, the salt collector said quietly. I cannot do this with what you have. I will need to gather more of the salt from the caves. It will take time, and you must understand, if we proceed with this, there is no turning back. What happens next is not something you can undo. Eamon nodded eagerly, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Do whatever you have to do. I'll wait. Just don't sit. Let her be gone. The salt collector left the cottage, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. He walked through the village, though his mind was miles away, consumed with the thoughts of what lay ahead. The salt whispered to him again, as if reminding him of the power it held. The closer he got to the cave entrances, the more pronounced the feeling became. It wasn't just the sea air or the damp rocks that felt unsettling. It was the very presence of the salt, the sense that it was alive, aware, waiting for him to make his move. Once he reached the caves, he stood for a moment, taking in the vast darkness before him. The salt had always been there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the collector to come and take it. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like the salt was waiting for something more. The collector descended into the depths, his lantern casting strange shadows on the walls as he walked deeper into the cave system. The further he went, the more the whispers grew. They were louder now, pressing in on him from all sides. It was as though the salt itself was urging him forward, goading him to continue, to give in to its power. He reached the chamber where he had harvested the salt for years, a small, hidden alcove at the heart of the cave. The salt crystals lay scattered across the stone floor, their edges glowing faintly in the dim light. He knelt down and began gathering the salt into a small leather pouch, feeling its weight as it settled in his palm. But this time, he didn't feel the usual calm that came with working with the substance. This time, he felt a tension, a pull, as though the salt itself was aware of his intentions. The whispers were growing louder now, the salt demanding something from him, something he wasn't sure he was willing to give. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. But even as he filled the pouch with the precious crystals, a deep gnawing fear took root in his chest. What was he really doing? Was he really trying to undo what had happened? Or was he simply making the same mistake again? Could he control the salt, or had it already begun to control him? With the pouch of salt in hand, the collector made his way back to the village, his mind swirling with 100 conflicting thoughts. He knew that what awaited him at Amon's cottage would be the true test. Would the salt give life back to Elaria, or would it demand something far worse than either man could have ever imagined? When he returned, Amon was waiting for him, his face pale and drawn. "You have it?" he asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. The salt collector nodded slowly, handing over the pouch of salt. "This is the last of it," he said quietly. "Once we use it, there sits no going back. Are you sure you want to do this?" Amon didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'll do anything." The collector nodded, and together they moved toward the small room where Leror's body lay. The room was cold, the air heavy with the scent of death. Amon's sister, once so full of life, now lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale and still. The salt collector hesitated for only a moment before sprinkling the salt across her chest. Almost immediately, a faint glow emanated from the crystals, casting an eerie light over the room. For a moment nothing happened, but then, slowly, Leora's body began to stir. Her chest rose, then fell, and her eyes fluttered open, wide and unseeing. Amon gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. "She sips alive, she sips." But as he stepped closer to his sister, the salt collector's eyes widened with horror. Leora's face, once beautiful and full of life, now looked wrong. Her eyes were wide, but there was no life in them. Her skin was ashen, her body cold to the touch. She didn't move, she didn't speak, she simply stared, unblinking, into the void. The salt had returned her to life, but something else had taken its place. The room was deathly silent, save for the steady, shallow breaths coming from Leora's body. Amon's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears as he moved closer to his sister. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch her, but the moment his fingers brushed her cold, ashen skin, a strange chill ran through him. It wasn't the coolness of death. No, it was something else entirely, something unnatural. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, stared into nothingness, empty and lifeless. Amon's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint that she had returned to herself. But there was nothing. Her body might have been alive again, but her soul, her essence, gone. "Leora?" Amon whispered, his voice cracking as he knelt beside her. He shook her gently, but there was no response, no sign that she heard him. His eyes searched her face desperately, looking for any flicker of life, any hint of the woman she had been, but there was nothing. The salt collector stood in the doorway, watching with a mixture of dread and resignation. He had warned Amon. He had told him there was no turning back, and now, it seemed, they had both paid the price for their actions. The whispers of the salt were louder now, almost deafening. The salt, it seemed, was pleased with what had been done. It had given what they had asked for. Life had been returned to Leora's body, but at what cost? What had been taken in exchange for this twisted mockery of life? Amon looked up at the salt collector, his face filled with desperation. What's Sipped happening? Why isn't Sipped she really back? She sips alive, but she sips not her. The collector's voice was quiet, heavy with the knowledge of what he had unleashed. "It was always a risk," he said softly. "The salt can restore life, but it doesn't always return things the way they were. It gives, yes, but it takes. And what you've brought back, it's not her, not entirely." Amon sat, face twisted in agony. "What do you mean? I wanted her back. I wanted her to be whole." The salt collector lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them in front of him. "It sits not just about healing the body. It sits about the soul. The salt may have restored her flesh, but it can bring back the essence of who she was. It can bring back the person." Amon's face went pale. "So what? What is she now? What have we done?" The salt collector hesitated. He had feared this moment, but it had come nonetheless. He could feel the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him, heavier than the salt he had harvested. The salt had done what it was meant to do. It had returned life to the dead, but it had left something behind in the process. The price of that life was a soul, a mind, a spirit that could never be restored, not fully. I don't know, the collector admitted, his voice strained. She sips, something else now, something inhuman. She sips alive, but she is not living in the way we understand it. Aemon recoiled, as if struck by the full weight of his mistake. He took a step back from his sister Septa's body, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What? What do I do? Is she... Are we cursed? Is this my fault? The salt collector could see the despair in Aemon's eyes, and his heart ached for the man. But there was no easy answer, no way to undo what had been done. They had bargained with forces beyond their understanding, and now they would both have to face the consequences. The salt whispered again, louder than before. It was almost as if it was calling to the collector, urging him to use it once more, to push the boundaries even further. He could feel the power growing, the temptation rising within him. The salt had always promised more power, more healing, but at what cost? Aemon, the collector said, his voice low and steady, you sip seen what the salt can do. You sip seen what its sip's done to her, but you need to understand, its sip's not something that can be controlled. Once you sips made that bargain, there's sips no going back. The salt doesn't sips give for free. It takes. Aemon stood frozen, his eyes locked on his sister's unmoving form. He seemed to be weighing the words, trying to make sense of them, but the grief was still raw, still burning in his chest. Is there any way to fix this? His voice was barely a whisper, full of desperate hope. The collector Sip's gaze softened, but there was little he could say to offer comfort. The salt has claimed a price. It has claimed a soul, a part of her, and I don't think there is a way to return that. It cannot be undone. But what if I could make it right? Aemon asked, his eyes wild with a new frantic energy. He looked at the salt collector, pleading with him, as though the collector held the key to saving her, saving himself. What if there's still something we can do? The salt collector shook his head slowly. The only thing left is to destroy the salt, to rid the village of it entirely. If we don't sit, it will continue to demand its price. More lives, more souls. Aemon Sit's face contorted with confusion and anger. Destroy it. But it sits the only thing that can bring her back. It sits the only thing that saved her. You saying we just throw it away. I stem saying, the collector said gently, his voice filled with regret, that the salt will never give you what you want, not in the way you think. It will take, and it will demand, and it will always leave something behind that you cannot restore. There was a long silence, the only sound the faint whispering of the salt, as if mocking their helplessness. Aemon finally dropped his gaze to the floor, his body shaking with grief and frustration. I don't know what to do anymore. I wanted her back, but now she sips. The salt collector stepped closer to Aemon, placing a hand on his shoulder. You done what you could, but sometimes the price is too high. Sometimes there are no happy endings, and sometimes the only way forward is to let go of the past. Aemon Sit's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how. I don't know how to let go. The salt collector gave him a sad smile. You may not be able to now, but in time you will. You still find a way. We all do. But as the salt collector turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers of the salt were not finished with them yet. They would never be finished. The salt had taken one life already, but how many more would it claim before its thirst was satisfied? The days following the tragic resurrection were not kind to either the salt collector or Aemon. The village, though it had been spared from illness for now, seemed to simmer with an uneasy tension, a quiet discomfort that had settled over it like a thick fog. People still came to the salt collector for cures, still trusted him to heal their wounds and ailments, but there was a growing awareness, an unspoken understanding that something was wrong. The salt had become a secret too heavy to bear. Aemon rarely left his sister's side. Leora, though physically alive, had become an unsettling shell of what she once was. She did not speak. She did not move, except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes, wide and vacant, stared at nothing, unblinking and unseeing. The village whispered about her too. Was she dead? Was she alive? No one knew for certain, and Aemon, racked with guilt and confusion, could not bear to be apart from her. But as the days stretched into weeks, Aemon's grief began to take a darker turn. He started to believe, desperately, that the salt could fix her, that it could restore what had been lost. He began to research old alchemical texts, poring over manuscripts that spoke of life, death, and resurrection, trying to find some trace of hope. The salt collector, too, felt the pull. It was as if the salt had become an addiction, a need that gnawed at him from the inside. The whispers were louder than ever now, their voices urgent and commanding. They spoke of power, of transcendence, of immortality. The temptation was there, always just out of reach, and the collector found himself slipping further into obsession. He had always understood the salt's potential, but now its promises seemed to mock him. Why had he not used it to its full potential? Why had he hesitated? He spent long hours in the cave, working with the salt, testing its limits, trying to understand its true nature. There were times when he thought he heard Leora's voice calling to him from the depths of the cave, soft, almost like a memory, but insistent. She was not gone, not entirely. She was still there, trapped in the space between life and death. The salt could bring her back, if only he was willing to use more of it, if only he could control it. But the more the salt whispered, the more the collector realized how dangerous it had become. This was no simple mineral. It was alive in a way that defied understanding, with its own will and purpose. It did not simply heal. It did not simply restore. It was far older, far more powerful than he had ever imagined, and now it seemed to be demanding more from him. It wanted something from him that he was unwilling to give. Still, the temptation was almost irresistible. One evening, after a particularly long night in the caves, the collector returned to his cottage, exhausted and mentally strained. As he crossed the threshold, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. Aemon was standing in front of him, his face drawn and desperate. The man looked as if he hadn't slept in days. "I've been thinking," Aemon said, his voice shaking, "about what you said, about the salt. You said it could be undone. You said it could be destroyed." The collector raised an eyebrow. "You want to destroy the salt?" Aemon nodded, his eyes wide with a frenzied intensity. "I want to destroy it. I want to get rid of it. If it's Sep's responsible for what Sep's happened to Leora, then I set'll destroy it. I set'll make sure it never hurts anyone again." The salt collector was silent for a moment, taken aback by the sudden determination in Aemon's voice. He had never expected the man to take such an extreme approach. Most people, when faced with the truth of what the salt had done, were either too afraid or too addicted to let it go. But Aemon had nothing left to lose. "Aemon, you don't understand," the collector said quietly. "Destroying the salt, one sect fixed this. It's Sept too late. The salt has already claimed something. It has claimed her, and it will continue to claim more, as long as its Sept's allowed to exist." Aemon clenched his fists. "Then we stop it. We stop it before it takes more lives, before it takes any more of her." The collector sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. He could see the determination in Aemon's eyes, but he also saw the madness that had begun to take root there. "You think destroying the salt will make a difference?" he asked, his voice filled with weariness. "The salt has already changed everything. It cannot be destroyed so easily. And even if we could, even if we burned it all away, it would not bring her back. It would not undo what we've done." Aemon Sect's eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring up. "You don't Sect understand. You Sept to the one who gave it to me. You Sept to the one who introduced me to it. You Sept been using it for years. You Sept seen what it does. And now you Sept are telling me it's Sept's too late." The salt collector stepped forward, his face stern. "A Sept's not saying it's Sept's too late. A Sept's saying that we Sept already crossed a line. We Sept's made a deal with something we don't Sept understand, something far more powerful than either of us. And now we must live with the consequences." Aemon Nett's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. His face was twisted with rage and grief. "No, I want Nett to live with this. I want Nett to live with her like this." The collector sips, eyes softened. "You have to let her go, Aemon. She sips, not the person you remember. The salt took something from her, and it will take more from you if you keep holding on. We both have to let go, or the salt will keep feeding on us. Aemon shook his head, his voice trembling with emotion. I can sit, let go. She sips all I have left. The salt collector stepped closer, placing a hand on Aemon's shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, but he could feel the tension in the air. He knew what had to be done, but he also knew that Aemon wasn't ready to accept it. The salt had already taken too much. Now it was taking everything. We all have to let go, Aemon, for our own sake, for the village, for her. Aemon pulled away from the collector's touch, his face contorted with pain. He turned toward the door, but before he could leave, the collector spoke once more, his voice low and heavy. You can sit, save her. You can sit, save anyone with the salt. Aemon stopped, his back to the collector. For a long moment he didn't sip to speak. Then, without turning around, he whispered, I don't sit know what to do any more. And with that, he left, disappearing into the night. The salt collector stood in the doorway, watching him go. He knew Aemon would return to Leora, that he would continue to try and restore her. The price of the salt was steep, and it had already begun to claim more than he could have imagined. But the true price, what it would take from all of them before the end, remained to be seen. The salt had always promised more, and now, it seemed, it was finally ready to collect. The days blurred together in a haze of quiet desperation. Aemon's obsession with the salt and his sister's condition deepened, and the village's atmosphere grew more oppressive. Whispers of the strange happenings surrounding Leora filled the streets. Was she truly alive? Was she a ghost? The villagers who had once turned to the salt collector for help began to speak in hushed tones about the unnaturalness of it all. Some avoided him altogether, and others, too frightened to approach, simply stayed away from Aemon and Leora's cottage. The salt collector, meanwhile, spent more and more time in the caves. His own obsession grew, too. He began to experiment more recklessly with the salt, pushing its limits. The whispers from the depths had become constant now, an overwhelming presence in his mind urging him forward. They promised power, immortality, and mastery over life and death. But the salt also warned that there would be a cost, always a cost. He could feel it, could almost taste it, but the allure of the salt's power was too great to resist. The collector had not yet dared to tell Aemon the full truth, that the salt was never meant to be used so recklessly, that every time they used it, they were not just healing, they were feeding it, growing its strength. The more the salt was used, the more it demanded, and once it had fed enough, it would never stop, it would never let go. One evening, as twilight descended on the village, the salt collector found himself standing in front of the cave entrance, gazing at the vast, endless sea before him. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks with a rhythmic force, almost as though the ocean itself was calling to him. He could hear the whispers more clearly now, like a constant hum at the back of his mind, pulling him toward the caves, toward the salt, toward something he couldn't yet name. It was then that he made a decision. He would go deeper, much deeper than he ever had before. The salt had taken so much, and it had given so little in return. But perhaps, just perhaps, if he could harness the full extent of its power, he could undo the damage. He could fix Leora. He could fix everything. He could transcend the mortal realm and become something more. The salt had always promised immortality, and tonight he would see if that promise was true. As he descended deeper into the caves, the walls seemed to close in around him. The air was thick and damp, and the salty tang of the ocean grew more pungent with every step. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if the salt was speaking directly to him now, urging him onward, coaxing him to cross the threshold into something darker. The salt collector reached the central chamber, the place where he had harvested the salt for so many years. The crystals glowed faintly in the dim light, their edges sharp and jagged, like teeth waiting to tear into him. He knelt and began to collect the salt once more, but this time he was not careful. This time he was desperate. He gathered as much as he could, pouring it into the large stone bowls that lined the walls of the chamber. Each handful of salt seemed to hum with energy, and as he added more, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the salt itself was feeding on the energy in the air. The power in the cave was palpable now, a living, breathing force that seemed to wrap around him, suffocating him with its presence. And then, as he completed the ritual, something shifted. The air grew still. The whispers stopped. For a moment he wondered if he had done something wrong, had he gone too far, but then the salt began to glow in an eerie light, pulsating with a rhythm of its own. The crystals seemed to shimmer, growing brighter with each passing second. The ground beneath him trembled, as though the very earth was alive with energy, a force that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Suddenly the salt surged upward, and the ground cracked open before him. The collector stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest as the earth split wide, revealing a glowing fissure in the rock. And from within the fissure, a dark shape began to emerge, something ancient, something that had been sleeping for far longer than the village, than the collector, than even the salt itself. It was then that he realized what he had unleashed. The salt had been feeding on them all along, not just Aemon, not just Leora, but every single person who had come to him for help. It had been growing, accumulating power with each use, each healing, each bargain, and now it had grown strong enough to break free of its prison beneath the sea. The collector staggered back, his mind racing. He had been warned, he knew he had been warned, but in his desperation, he had ignored the signs. He had thought he could control it. He had thought he could outwit the salt, but now it was clear, it was not a force to be controlled. It was a force to be reckoned with. The dark shape that emerged from the crack in the earth was no longer just a whisper. It was a presence, dark and powerful, swirling with an energy that filled the cave with an oppressive weight. It spoke without words, but the message was clear. It was not just a force of nature, it was alive, it was aware, and now it was hungry. The salt collector's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward. He could feel the salt's power calling to him, tempting him to take just one more step, to embrace it fully, to become part of it. But deep down, he knew he had made a mistake, a fatal mistake. The salt had taken everything from him, his knowledge, his sanity, his morality, and now it was taking the village. It was taking everything. As the dark shape fully emerged from the fissure, the salt collector knew there was only one thing left to do. He had to stop it. He had to destroy it before it consumed him, before it consumed them all. With a final, desperate cry, he reached for the pouch of salt in his belt, preparing to do what he had never dared before, to destroy it. He had to burn it, banish it from the earth. But as his fingers brushed the pouch, the shape lunged toward him, faster than he could react, its dark presence overwhelming him. The last thing he felt before the darkness closed in was the salt's whispering in his mind, a whisper that promised the end, a whisper that promised everything he had ever wanted. And then, silence. The cave was silent. The echoes of the collector's final cry had long since dissipated, swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the dark chamber. The glowing fissure that had once pulsed with dark energy now lay dormant, its power seemingly extinguished. The salt, once so alive with promise, was still. For a long moment, there was nothing. No whispers, no tremors, just the heavy, suffocating silence. But then, as though slowly coming to life, the ground beneath the salt collector's body began to stir. The earth trembled, faintly at first, then more pronounced. The darkness that had been bound to the salt, to the very land itself, had not been destroyed. It had only slumbered, waiting for the collector's final act of defiance to complete its cycle. His body, though seemingly still, was not untouched by the power of the salt. The dark shape had vanished, retreating back into the fissure, but the salt collector felt its presence lingering in the air, wrapping around him like an invisible chain. The salt had not been banished, it had only grown stronger, feeding off his actions, feeding off his desire to control what could not be controlled. He could still hear the whispering in his mind, a sound so faint, so far away, but still present. It was familiar now, like an old friend, or perhaps more like an enemy, that had long since taken residence within him. The collector opened his eyes, slowly, as though waking from a nightmare. He was still in the cave, but the scene before him was different. The chamber that had once been full of salt crystals was now bare. The glowing fissure had closed, leaving nothing but smooth rock in its wake. The salt he had so carefully harvested was gone, scattered into the earth, consumed by whatever dark force had arisen from the depths. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The weight of it all crashed down on him. The salt, the power, the irreversible cost of his choices. He had tried to destroy it, to rid himself of its influence. But it was clear now, the salt wasn't something you could destroy. It wasn't something that could be controlled or eliminated. It was part of the land, part of the sea, a presence for older than anything he had understood. He stood shakily, his body bruised from the fall he had taken, and glanced toward the entrance of the cave. The outside world seemed so distant now, a place he could no longer touch. The salt had taken everything from him, his sanity, his knowledge, his life. He had let it consume him, let it whisper promises of power and immortality, and in return, it had fed on his every doubt, his every fear. He stumbled toward the mouth of the cave, his legs weak beneath him. He had to leave. He had to find Eamon. He had to warn him, before it was too late. As he emerged into the cool night air, he noticed a strange stillness in the village. The usual sounds, the murmur of voices, the clinking of tools, the laughter of children were absent. The village felt empty, as if something had swallowed it whole. The salt collector's breath caught in his throat as he made his way through the empty streets, feeling the weight of every step. He could sense it now. The salt was everywhere. It had spread through the village, woven into the very fabric of their lives. No one was untouched. No one was safe. When he reached Eamon's cottage, he hesitated before knocking on the door. What would he say? How could he explain what had happened? He had warned Eamon, but had he really understood the depth of the danger? Eamon answered the door, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. When he saw the collector standing there, his expression flickered between surprise and something darker, recognition perhaps. Recognition of what had happened, recognition of what had been done. "You came back," Eamon said hoarsely, his voice trembling. I thought, lost you." The salt collector Sip's throat tightened, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had done. "You were right," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. "It's Sip's too late. It's Sip's already here." Eamon Sep's eyes widened. "What do you mean? What disappointing? Where's Sip's Leora?" The collector stepped inside, and the door creaked closed behind him. The house was dark, the air thick with an unnatural heaviness. Eamon's sister Leora was sitting in the corner, her body still as ever, her eyes wide open, staring into the emptiness of the room. She looked like a corpse, but she breathed slowly, heavily, unnaturally. "Leora," Eamon whispered, his voice breaking. He ran to her, but as he reached out, the collector grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Don't act," the collector said urgently. "You don't act, understand. Isip's not her anymore. Isip's never going to be her again." Eamon pulled away, his face twisted in disbelief and pain. "No, she sips here. She sips alive. I can feel her. I can sit, let go. I can sit." The salt collector Sip's voice softened, as though speaking to himself. "You don't sit, have a choice. The salt has taken her. Is Sip's taken all of us. And now it's Sip's coming for more." Eamon froze, his body trembling as if he had been struck. He turned back toward Leora, his hands hovering above her. She remained still, her chest rising and falling, but her eyes were vacant, hollow. The salt collector could feel the pull of it, deep within him. The salt had spread through the village, through everyone. It had become something far worse than he had ever imagined. He could feel it now, seeping through the walls, through the very air, feeding off their fears, their grief, their desperation. "Its Sep's already begun," the collector said softly, almost to himself. "Its Sep's not just the salt anymore, it's Sep's everything." Suddenly, Leora's body twitched, her fingers twitching in a grotesque, jerking motion. Eamon recoiled, stepping back with a gasp. He turned to the collector, his eyes wide with terror. "What's happening? What did we do?" Eamon's voice was panicked, his chest heaving with the realization that everything had gone too far. The salt collector didn't have an answer. He had never truly understood the salt's power, but now, as Leora's body began to move unnaturally, jerking and twitching in a way no living being should, he knew the answer wasn't something they could undo. It wasn't something they could control. It was already too late. The air in Eamon's cottage grew heavier as Leora's body spasmed and jerked with increasing violence. Her fingers twitched, then curled, then straightened again. The once peaceful, lifeless shell of a woman was now something else entirely, something unrecognizable, something twisted by the salt's unholy power. Her skin, which had once been pale, was now mottled with dark veins, veins that pulsed as though something was moving beneath the surface. Her breath was uneven, a ragged, unnatural wheeze that sent shivers down the salt collector's spine. Eamon, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, stood rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on his sister. The love he had once felt for her, the need to bring her back, had blinded him to the truth. This wasn't a resurrection, it was something much darker. "No," Eamon whispered, his voice cracking. "No, no, no. This isn't set her. This can set be her." The salt collector stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Leora. He could feel it too, the overwhelming presence of the salt, now fully awake and alive, pulsing through the very fabric of the house. It had spread far beyond the caves, far beyond what he had ever imagined. It had already consumed the village, and now it was consuming them all. "The salt, it didn't just bring her back," the collector said softly. It took her soul, and now it seps using her body." Eamon shook his head violently, as if trying to shake the truth out of his mind. "No, she sips still in there. I can feel her. I know she sips still in there." The collector Sip's voice dropped to a low, guttural tone. "Eamon, this isn't Sip just about her. The salt doesn't Sip bring back the dead. It doesn't Sip restore. It feeds. It feeds off grief, off desperation. And the more you use it, the stronger it gets." Leora's body began to jerk more violently, her eyes snapping open wide, revealing irises that were not hers, black as coal, voids of nothing. They fixed on Eamon, and a low, rasping sound began to emerge from her throat, a sound that was not human. It was a mix of a gurgling growl and a breathless hiss, as though whatever remained of Leora was struggling to break free. Eamon staggered backward, his hands trembling as he looked at his sister, now transformed into a creature that was more nightmare than human. "Leora! Leora! Please!" His voice was broken with grief and terror, but the thing that used to be his sister did not respond. Instead, it let out a twisted, gurgling laugh, deep and guttural. The salt collector watched, his heart sinking. He had warned him. He had warned them both. But there was no reversing this, no second chances. The salt had claimed its prize. "Amund," the collector said quietly, his voice almost lost beneath the monstrous sound of Leora Sep's jerking body. "Is Sep's too late for her? Is Sep's too late for all of us?" The whispers of the salt, once so subtle, now roared in his mind, urging him to do something, anything. But he knew there was nothing left to do. The salt had taken everything. It had eaten away at his soul, at Eamon's, at the very fabric of the village, and now it would take more. "Stop!" Eamon suddenly snapped, his eyes wild with a mixture of anger and anguish. "Don't set say that. You don't set know her like I do. She sips in there. I can feel her. I can save her." The collector Sip's eyes softened with sorrow, but he didn't sit to look away from Leora. "You don't sit know her, Eamon. Not anymore. The salt has consumed everything. The woman you loved is gone." A guttural scream tore through the air as Leora's body rose from the chair, her limbs stiff and rigid like a marionette on strings. She turned slowly toward Eamon, her head twisting unnaturally to the side. The movement was inhuman, grotesque. The twisted smile on her face was the last straw. It was no longer her face. This was something else, something born of darkness. "No," Eamon screamed, his voice breaking as he rushed toward her, ignoring the collector Sep's warnings. "No, Leora, please, please, come back." But as he reached for her, Leora's head snapped around to face him with a horrifying speed, her once beautiful face now contorted with an expression of pure malice. Her lips parted, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. The air around her seemed to crackle with dark energy, a force that made the collector's skin crawl. Before Eamon could even react, Leora lunged at him, her arms flailing outward, the inhuman strength within her too much for Eamon to resist. The salt collector moved quickly, pulling Eamon away, but it was already too late. The damage was done. Leora's head snapped back, her body jerking unnaturally, and for a brief moment it seemed as though she might regain some semblance of human form, an echo of the woman Aemon had loved. But then, the salt surged within her again, and all that remained was the soulless, hunger-driven creature before them. Aemon collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice broken. The collector placed a hand on his shoulder, but there was little he could offer. The village was already lost, and so was Aemon's sister. The salt had consumed her. The salt had consumed everything. The salt collector took a slow breath, his mind running through every regret, every mistake, every warning he had ignored. He had tried to stop it before, tried to control it, but now it was clear. The salt had never been something to control. It had never been something to wield, and now it would claim them all. "We have to leave," the collector said quietly, his voice tinged with finality. "The salt will keep taking. There's Sep's no stopping it now, but we can still try to save what Sep's left." Aemon, still trembling, shook his head. "What's Sep's left? There's Sep's nothing left. Sep's lost her." The collector turned toward the door. "The village is lost, but you don't have to be." Aemon's eyes locked on the collector's face, searching for something, some hope, some way to fix this, but all the collector could offer was a sad, understanding gaze. The salt had already taken too much, and now it was coming for them all. Damon didn't respond to the collector's words. His body was frozen, eyes glazed over, as if he had already given up on everything, including himself. The horror of what he had done, the devastation that had become of his sister, were too much to bear. He was no longer the man who had fought for her life. He was a man consumed by guilt, by grief, by the realization that there was no way to undo the damage. But the salt collector knew that if they were to survive, if anyone were to survive, they had to leave the cottage, leave the village, and try to break the hold the salt had on them all. The longer they stayed, the more it would consume. The salt had fed on desperation, grief and fear, and it was clear now, as Leora's horrific form jerked and twitched in the corner, that it would not stop until it had taken everything. But the collector couldn't abandon Aemon to this nightmare. Not completely. He turned back toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. "Aemon," he said softly, "we can stay here. We have to go." Aemon barely stirred. His gaze remained locked on the twisted figure of his sister, as if trying to will her back to life with nothing more than his broken heart. "I can leave her," Aemon whispered, his voice distant, hollow. "She sits all I have left." The collector knelt beside him, looking into his eyes. "You've lost her already, Aemon. This thing," he nodded toward Aurora, her contorted figure slowly moving, as though savoring the terror it caused, "isn't your sister anymore. And if we don't leave, it will consume us all." Aemon's hands trembled, but his eyes remained fixed on the grotesque image of his sister. The sharp teeth, the lifeless stare, it was all so wrong. His heart felt as if it were being ripped apart. He had asked for the impossible. He had begged for a cure, for something that could bring her back, and instead, he had unleashed a nightmare. The salt collector felt a surge of sympathy for the man sitting next to him. He understood the pain, the desperation. He had seen it in countless faces before, the urge to hold on, to defy the inevitable. But he also knew that the salt didn't care about their desires. It didn't care about the lives it destroyed. It only cared about feeding. "I know this is hard," the collector said quietly, "but we can fix this. Not here, not now. If you stay, the salt will keep feeding. It will grow stronger, and it will come for more people. It will consume everything." Aemon turned his face toward the collector, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "What do we do then?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Where do we go?" The collector took a deep breath. This wasn't something he could solve with words. It wasn't something that could be fixed with an easy solution or a quick fix. The salt had already taken too much. There was only one thing left to do. "We need to destroy it," he said, his voice firm. "We need to go back to the caves and destroy the salt. All of it. Burn it. Bury it. Make sure it never comes back." Aemon blinked, as if the weight of the words had not fully settled in his mind. "Destroy it," he repeated, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You think we can just destroy it?" "Yes," the salt collector replied. "It's the only way. We can let it spread any further. We can Let it consume any more lives. For a long moment the cottage was silent, save for the sound of Leora's gurgling, rasping breath. The collector could see the doubt in Eamon's eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, but there was nothing left to do. Nothing but to try to stop the spread of the salt, to make sure it never took anyone else. Finally, Eamon stood up, his hands shaking as he wiped the tears from his eyes. He was a broken man, but there was still a flicker of something left, perhaps a desire to save what little remained of his humanity, or maybe just the smallest shred of hope that he could undo his mistakes. But whatever it was, it pushed him forward. "Let 6 go," Eamon said quietly, his voice hollow but determined. "If we have any chance of stopping this, we have to do it now." The salt collector nodded, his expression grim. They couldn't stay here any longer. The village had already been consumed. Eamon's sister had already been consumed. It was only a matter of time before the salt would take more, and it would continue to spread, to grow, to consume. The two of them made their way out of the cottage, the door creaking shut behind them. Eamon cast one last, lingering glance at Leora, her body still jerking, still contorting in unnatural movements. His face twisted in pain, but he forced himself to turn away. They walked through the village, a place that had once been full of life but now felt empty, abandoned. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if the village was holding its breath, waiting for something worse to happen. As they reached the edge of the village, the salt collector looked at Eamon, his face solemn. "We have to hurry. The longer we wait, the stronger it gets." They both knew what they had to do. The salt had to be destroyed, or the village, no, the world would fall to its insatiable hunger. They walked together, their steps heavy with the weight of what they had lost and what they still had left to do. The caves seemed darker than they had ever been, as if the salt had cast a shadow over everything it touched. The collector led Eamon deep into the heart of the caves, where the salt had once been harvested, where it had once been thought of as a miracle. Now, it was nothing more than a curse. They reached the central chamber, where the salt had first been drawn from the earth. The collector glanced around at the empty space, his heart heavy. It felt as if the walls themselves were watching them, waiting. "We have to burn it," the salt collector said, his voice low. "Every last grain. It can be allowed to spread." But as he began to gather the salt, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They spoke to him, calling him to stay, to take more, to push further. The temptation was overwhelming, but he resisted, pushing the salt into the flames. As the crystals burned, they crackled and popped, emitting a strange, haunting glow that filled the chamber. But the salt had one last trick up its sleeve. A cold wind swept through the cave, and the whispers became screams, rising up from the depths of the earth. The ground beneath them trembled. The salt had not been destroyed, it had only been provoked. It was far from over. The air in the cave thickened, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The flames crackled wildly, but instead of burning the salt away, it seemed to feed the darkness. The strange glow from the crystals became more intense, brighter, like a beacon calling from the deep. The salt had been disturbed, and in that disturbance it began to awaken. The whispers, which had been faint murmurs at first, were now screaming, howling in his mind. The collector could hear them all around him, as if the cave itself were alive. The salt had always been a part of the earth, but now it felt as if it was far more, something ancient, something primordial. It was reaching out, its hunger insatiable, and it wanted more. "What's happening?" Eamon gasped, his voice trembling. He stood beside the collector, fear clouding his eyes as he stared at the glowing salt crystals, which now pulsed rhythmically, as though they had a heartbeat. "It sits not just salt," the collector said, his voice hoarse with dread. "It sits a force, something older than anything we can understand. We have awoken it. And now it one sit stop." Eamon backed away, his body stiff with fear. "I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be part of this." His hands trembled as he looked at the fire, the salt, and the cave sips, dark corners. "What did we do?" The collector's face was pale, his thoughts racing. The salt had never been just a cure. It was a force of nature, an elemental power bound by ancient rules, laws long forgotten by the world above. He had never truly understood the depth of it, And now, standing in the heart of the cave, surrounded by the restless energy of the salt, he knew it was too late. He could feel it, its presence in every molecule of air, in every crack in the stone. It was hungry. It had been given a taste, and now it demanded more. The fire, the burning salt, it wasn't enough. The salt would keep coming back, reforming, drawing power from the earth. It wouldn't be destroyed so easily. It's sips feeding, the collector muttered. The salt feeds off destruction. Every attempt to get rid of it just makes it stronger. The ground beneath them shook more violently, a deep rumble echoing through the cave. The very earth seemed to groan with the force of it. The collector stumbled, feeling the tremors in his bones. His heart pounded. The whispers were growing louder, sharper, more forceful. He could feel them pressing in on him, urging him to give in, to accept the power. No, he whispered to himself, shaking his head. I won't sit to let it consume me. Not again. But it was too late. From the darkness of the cave, something began to emerge, something vast, something alive. The salt had awakened, and now it was rising, breaking free from the earth itself. The very walls of the cave began to shift, as though the stone was being pulled apart, the ground cracking open. The salt had gathered force, and now it was pulling itself from the depths. The collector reached for Aemon, his voice hoarse. "We have to leave. Now, the salt is no longer something we control. It's something we set unleashed." But Aemon was rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with horror as the salt began to take shape. The ground cracked open fully now, and from the fissure, a massive wave of salt surged upward, swirling into the air like a storm of shimmering, jagged crystals. It rose, coalescing into a form, a figure, a monstrous silhouette that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that defied the natural order. Aemon Set's breath caught in his throat. What is that? What is happening? The collector couldn't speak. He could only watch in silent terror as the salt formed into a colossal being, its body composed entirely of the shimmering, razor-sharp crystals. It loomed over them, towering high above, its form constantly shifting, like the ocean waves crashing against the shore. The air around it was thick with power, with the energy of the salt that had fed for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise. The whispers were no longer in his mind. They were in the air, vibrating, reaching out, wrapping around them both like a physical presence. "You've awoken me," a voice rumbled, a voice that sounded like the sound of rocks grinding together, deep and reverberating. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something that could be understood by mortal minds. It was the salt, the force that had been buried beneath the earth for so long, and now it had returned. "You have disturbed the balance." The collector stood frozen, his heart racing. "What are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The creature, or whatever it was, shifted, its massive form twisting, its body of salt crackling as it reformed. "I am the salt. I am the earth and the sea. I am the hunger of time. You cannot destroy me, for I was here long before you, and I will remain long after you." The collector felt his blood run cold as the realization hit him. They had not simply uncovered the salt. They had disturbed something ancient, something primordial. It wasn't a force that could be controlled. It was a force that existed outside of time and space, beyond comprehension, and it would not be stopped by fire or flame. Aemon, still trembling, stepped back. "What do you want from us?" The salt creature's sips form shimmered and pulsed. "I do not want from you. I take from you. You are the fuel that feeds me. And now that I am awake, I will not rest until all that you have known is consumed." The collector's stomach twisted. He knew what the salt wanted. It wanted life. It wanted energy. It had already fed on the village. It had already fed on Aemon's grief, on the desperation of the villagers. And now it was coming for more. It wanted more lives, more souls to feed its insatiable hunger. "We have to stop it," the collector said desperately, turning to Aemon. "We have to find a way." But Aemon Set's face was blank, drained of emotion. How? How do we stop it? We can destroy it. We can even understand it." The salt creature loomed over them, its form rippling with power. "You cannot stop what is inevitable." You cannot stop what is timeless. The ground cracked again, the salt swirling around them. It was too late. The salt had risen, and now it would take everything. The collector and Eamon were nothing more than pawns in its unending hunger. Run, the collector whispered, grabbing Eamon by the arm. Run while you can. I still hold it off. You need to escape. No, Eamon interrupted, his voice flat, devoid of the life it once held. We both stay. We face it. The collector scepter's eyes widened. Eamon, no! But it was too late. The salt was already consuming them both, feeding on their despair, their guilt, their regret. And as the salt's cold presence overwhelmed them, all the collector could do was watch as the last remnants of his humanity were swept away, consumed by the very force he had once believed he could control. And in the end, the salt took everything. The cave had become an abyss of darkness and swirling salt. Eamon and the salt collector stood on the precipice of that abyss, the creature of salt towering over them like a mountain of shifting crystal. Its presence filled the space, bending reality itself, pulling the very air from their lungs. Every breath was a struggle, each movement weighed down by the oppressive force that surrounded them. Eamon's hand was clenched tightly around the collector's wrist, his face drained of colour, his eyes wide with terror. The salt had wrapped itself around their minds, twisted their thoughts, distorted everything they had once believed to be true. The whispers, the promises, the hunger, it all combined into one deafening roar. The salt collector's thoughts raced. How had it come to this? How had the salt, the thing that had once seemed so simple, so benign, turned into a force that would consume everything in its path? Eamon, listen to me, the collector said, his voice barely audibles over the pounding of his own heartbeat. We can fight this. We have to escape. We have to get out of the cave before it. But Eamon shook his head, his face set with a cold determination. No, I once leave her. His voice cracked, barely a whisper. I once leave my sister, even if she sips, not her anymore. The salt collector's gaze softened, but the truth hit him like a hammer. He knew that what they were facing wasn't just a monster of salt. It was everything, the culmination of their failures, their greed, their desire to control that which was never meant to be controlled. Eamon's desperate need to save his sister had opened the door to this chaos, and now they were both trapped in it. Leora's body, twisted and distorted by the salt's influence, was still in the corner of the cave, its movements jerking with unnatural speed. The eyes that once belonged to a woman who had lived, loved, and laughed now looked out from a face that was a grotesque mockery of life. But even as the salt collector's heart clenched with pity for the woman Eamon had lost, he knew that there was no saving her, there was no coming back from what the salt had done. The creature of salt, now more monstrous than ever, towered before them, its form shifting and changing with every second. It seemed to feed off the confusion, the fear that clung to the air. Its voice boomed inside their minds, a voice that was not human, not even alive in any way they could understand. You awakened me, it rumbled, its voice a cacophony of whispers. You have already paid the price. And now I shall take what is mine. The salt collector clenched his fists, his mind reeling. He could feel the force of the salt's presence inside him, like something insidious, something crawling under his skin. It was trying to take him, to pull him into its hunger. But he fought back. No, he thought, I won't let it take me. Not like this. But there was no escaping it. Not anymore. The ground beneath them rumbled again, and the cave walls shook violently. The salt creature, now almost fully formed, stretched upward like a tidal wave of crystal, its jagged edges gleaming with a sickly light. Eamon stumbled back, his face stricken with horror. What is this? What is this thing? The collector could barely look at it, but he knew what had to be done. He had to end it, now, before it grew too powerful, before it consumed everything. We need to burn it all, he said, the words slipping from his lips like the only truth left in this shattered world. The salt. It can just be contained. It has to be destroyed completely. Eamon turned to him, eyes wild. How, Dao? How do we destroy it? The collector's gaze flickered toward the cave's entrance. He could still see the faint outline of the world outside, the village, the lives that had already been swallowed by the salt's hunger. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just run. They needed to stop it. Stop it for good. I don't know how, the collector admitted, his voice tinged with defeat. But we have to try. We have to do something, or it will keep coming for us. It will never stop. As the words left his mouth, the creature of salt let out a deafening screech, and the ground beneath them cracked open wider, pulling them both toward the abyss. The salt, like an insatiable beast, reached out with thousands of tendrils, each one swirling in every direction, each one reaching for them, trying to claim them. Eamon cried out, trying to pull away, but it was too late. The salt was already pulling them in, dragging them toward the center of the cave. The collector felt his body growing numb as the salt's tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him into the growing mass of crystals. It was impossible to fight back. The weight of it, the sheer power of the salt was too much, and the whispers, they were too loud now, rising up from the depths, filling his mind with nothing but hunger. But then, through the chaos, a single thought broke through, the thought of escape. No more. With everything he had left, the collector gathered the last of his strength and reached into the depths of the cave, searching for any kind of escape. He didn't know what he was looking for. He didn't know if it would work, but he had no other choice. The salt creature's roars grew louder, but the collector could feel the remnants of his power, their power, surging inside him. The salt wanted to consume him. It wanted to take him. But there was one thing he could still do. He could make the last stand, the final sacrifice. With one last desperate effort, he reached for the fire that had been burning on the stone altar in the center of the cave. The flames, though weak, were still there. He grabbed the fire with all the remaining strength he had, and then he threw it straight into the heart of the salt. For a moment nothing happened. There was just silence. And then boom. The explosion that followed was deafening, the roar of it shaking the very foundations of the cave. The salt screamed in agony, a sound like the roar of 1,000 voices, all crying out in one unified, heartbreaking scream. The creature of salt thrashed violently, its form cracking, shattering, its tendrils disintegrated, scattering into 1,000 shards of crystal. The very earth seemed to quake beneath them as the salt at last was burned away, destroyed in one final brilliant explosion of light. For a few moments, the cave was silent. The ground stopped trembling. The salt was gone. The collector's vision swam. His body, bruised and battered, was barely able to stand, but he could feel the weight of the salt lifting from his soul. Eamon stood beside him, just as broken, but still alive. The salt was gone, but at what cost? Eamon Sit's voice cracked, barely audible. We did it. We stopped it. The collector nodded, his mind reeling with the knowledge that they had won, but the victory felt hollow. The salt had taken so much from them both. The world outside awaited them, but it would never be the same. The village was lost, Leora was gone, and even though the salt had been destroyed, the scars it had left would never truly fade. Together, the salt collector and Eamon made their way out of the cave, leaving the ruins of the ancient evil behind them. But even as they walked toward the dawn, they knew the salt's hunger would never truly be satiated. The journey back to the village was quiet. The land around them was eerily still, the atmosphere heavy with the sense that the world had just witnessed something it couldn't comprehend. The salt had been destroyed, yes, but at such a terrible cost. The village they had once known, the people they had tried to save, were all gone. The lives that had been consumed, the innocents who had been drawn into the salt's hunger, were nothing more than distant memories now, echoes of a past that could never be revived. Eamon and the collector moved slowly, their steps dragging as though the weight of the world was upon their shoulders. Each footstep seemed to echo in the silence, their presence the only thing left in a world that had been consumed by the salt's hunger. When they reached the outskirts of the village, it was no different from when they had left, deserted, abandoned, as though time had simply forgotten it. The houses were empty, the streets overgrown with weeds, and the air smelled faintly of salt. The remnants of the village were like an old, forgotten dream, its life snuffed out, its heart torn out by the very thing that had once given it purpose. The salt collector paused, looking out over the empty streets. He could almost hear the echoes of laughter, of voices that had once filled the air with life. but it was gone now. The salt had taken everything, and in its wake there was nothing but hollow silence. "This is it," the collector said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "It seeps over." Eamon stood beside him, his face gaunt, his expression hollow. "We failed them," he said softly. "We couldn't stave them. We couldn't stave Leora." The collector shook his head. "You didn't fail anyone. The salt," he stopped himself, knowing the words would offer little comfort. Now, the truth was too painful, too real to deny. They had tried, yes, but in the end the salt had consumed them all. It had consumed everything. They had destroyed the salt, yes, but they hadn't destroyed the grief, the loss, the cost. It would follow them for the rest of their lives. "We didn't fail them," the collector repeated, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "We stopped the salt from taking more lives. That's all we could do." Eamon turned away from him, his eyes scanning the empty streets. His face was a mask of emptiness, a reflection of the soul-crushing grief that had consumed him. "But it wasn't enough," he muttered. "We should have done more. We should have topped more. We should have stopped it before it even started." The collector didn't answer right away. There was nothing more to say. What could they have done differently? What could anyone have done? They had been drawn into the salt's web, just like everyone else. They had given in to its power, its promise of healing, of immortality, and in the end, it had taken everything from them. They walked in silence for a long while, the only sound the soft crunch of their footsteps on the dusty road. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the abandoned village. The air was thick with the scent of salt and earth, the remnants of something ancient, something powerful. As they passed the homes that once held the villagers, the salt collector stopped in front of one of the houses. It was a small cottage, the door slightly ajar, the roof sagging under the weight of time. The windows were broken, the glass long since shattered, but there was something about it, a memory, a feeling that made him pause. He stepped forward, pushing the door open with a creak. Inside, it was dark, the light from the setting sun filtering through the broken windows in thin shafts. The room was empty, save for the remnants of what had once been. A few overturned chairs, a cracked table, a rusted kettle on the stove. It was as though the village had been abandoned in the middle of everyday life, with no warning, no time to prepare. He moved further into the room, his heart heavy, and then, in the corner of the room, he saw it, a small pile of salt. It had been left untouched, as though it had been discarded in haste. It gleamed faintly in the low light, its jagged edges catching the last rays of the sun. The collector knelt down, staring at the salt. His fingers brushed lightly over the crystals, feeling the cold, unyielding surface. For a moment he could hear the whispers again, faint, distant, but still there. The salt had never truly gone. It was still a part of them, a part of everything. Eamon stepped into the room behind him, his footsteps soft, his eyes downcast. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. The collector didn't answer right away. He could feel the salt's presence even now. It wasn't gone. It couldn't be gone. The hunger, the need, the insatiable thirst, it would always be a part of them. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't think it's ever really over." Eamon's gaze flickered to the salt. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The collector stood slowly, turning away from the pile of salt. His face was pale, his expression grim, but there was a new determination in his eyes. "We live. We keep moving forward. There's nothing else we can do." He walked toward the door, Eamon following behind him. They stepped out into the fading light of the day, the sky now a deep shade of purple. The village lay behind them, empty and silent, like a ghost of the past. And yet, as they moved further into the distance, the collector couldn't shake the feeling that the salt was still with them. It always would be. It had taken so much from them, so much from the world, and though they had destroyed the source, they would never be able to escape its grasp entirely. It had become a part of them, part of the earth, part of the sea, part of the hunger that would never be sated. As the last remnants of daylight faded, they walked in silence, knowing the journey ahead was uncertain, but the weight of the past would always follow them. The salt had taken everything, and there was nothing left but to keep moving. The journey away from the village stretched on in a heavy, oppressive silence. The sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon, and the cool evening air wrapped around them like a blanket, cold and unwelcoming. The distant sounds of the sea, once comforting to the villagers of Elaria, now seemed foreign, almost threatening. The collector and Eamon walked side by side, the last remnants of their shared history behind them, both of them deeply aware of the fact that what they had left could never be enough to fill the void that had been created. The salt had consumed the village, just as it had consumed their lives. They had managed to destroy it for now, but its presence lingered, an invisible stain on the land, an unspoken weight in the air. It was as if it had spread through every grain of sand, every blade of grass, and now it was a part of them always. The collector could feel it, the pull of its power, its whispers still faintly calling from the depths of his memory. Eamon, though silent for most of their journey, suddenly spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of everything they had lost. Do you think it was all inevitable?" The collector glanced at him, his steps faltering for just a moment. The question hung in the air between them, fragile and raw. Could it have been avoided? Could they have stopped it before it got this far? "I don't know," the collector said honestly, his voice low. Maybe if we had seen it for what it was sooner. But it was never just about the salt. It was about what we wanted from it. We wanted to control it. And once we started, there was no going back." Eamon's face twisted with a mix of guilt and frustration. I thought I could save her. I thought that by using it, I could bring Leora back, that I could fix everything." His voice cracked with the weight of his words. "But now, I see it. I see that I was just feeding it. The more I used it, the stronger it got. I didn't even realize it was changing everything around me, changing me." The salt collector nodded, his gaze distant. "We were all blinded by it. We saw it as a tool, something to fix, to heal. But it wasn't set a tool, it was a force. And the moment we started using it, we became part of its hunger." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the ghosts of lost dreams and shattered hope. Eamon's steps grew slower, more hesitant, as if the weight of his past actions was now pulling him down. The collector, too, felt the burden of what they had done, of the people they couldn't save, the lives that had been stolen from them by the salt's insidious reach. The two of them continued on in silence, the road ahead uncertain, the future foggy and indistinct. But one thing was clear, they could never return to the way things were. The village was gone, Leora was gone, and in many ways a part of both of them was gone as well. As they approached the outskirts of the village, the land began to open up before them, revealing the wild, untamed stretch of coastline that lay beyond. The sea was restless tonight, its waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks that marked the end of the land. It seemed as though the ocean itself was mourning, weeping for the destruction that had occurred. The collector stopped at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast, dark expanse of water. That salt was now part of the earth, part of the world and part of them. The wind carried the briny scent of the sea, mingling with the faint traces of salt that still clung to the earth, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. It lingered, always. "I don't just know where we go from here," Eamon said, his voice barely audible as he stood next to the collector. "I don't just even know if I can keep going." The collector turned to him, his eyes searching for some hint of the man Eamon had once been, the man who had fought so hard for his sister, who had believed in the impossible, the man who had once carried the hope of Elaria on his shoulders. "You stir still here," the collector said softly, "and that sip's enough, for now." Eamon shook his head, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding perhaps, or simply a deep aching sorrow that mirrored the collector sip's own. "I don't set know if it sips enough," he whispered. "It feels like too much, like there sips nothing left." The collector's gaze drifted back to the crashing waves below. The sea was vast, endless, its depths unknown. It had always been a symbol of life, of mystery, of nature's raw power. But now, to the collector, it felt like a reflection of the salt's power, immense, overwhelming, and unknowable. "We can keep moving," the collector said, his voice steady but quiet as if he was convincing himself as much as Eamon. "One step at a time, it sips all we can do." Eamon didn't reply, but the collector saw the faintest nod from the corner of his eye. It was something, a sign of life, even if it was small. They turned away from the cliff, the wind biting at their faces as they began to walk again, leaving the village behind. The path before them was uncertain, the future unclear, but one thing was certain: they would never stop feeling the weight of the salt, the way it had changed everything. It would follow them, lingering in the air like a memory they could never quite shake. For the rest of their lives, the salt would be with them. It would be in the way they spoke, in the way they moved through the world, in the way they carried their grief. And as they walked into the night, the salt collector knew this. Though the creature of salt was gone, the hunger remained. It would always remain. The days that followed felt like a blur, a continuous march through a world that had lost its meaning. Aemon and the collector continued their journey away from the village, but it was clear to both of them that there was no true escape. The salt had seeped into their bones, into the very air they breathed, and no matter how far they walked, it would always be a part of them. The past was woven into the fabric of their existence, and the salt, though destroyed in the caves, would never truly leave. They travelled through empty landscapes, fields that were once lush but now lay barren, forests that seemed to hold their breath in silent mourning. It was as though the world itself was echoing the emptiness they felt inside. Every place they passed was a reminder of what had been lost, and every step they took was one further into a future that seemed to offer no redemption. Haemon, once so driven by hope and the desire to save his sister, now walked with a heavy heart. The spark of life that had once ignited in him seemed dimmed, almost extinguished. The salt had taken not just Leora, but something deeper, something that Aemon couldn't name, and though the collector had tried to reassure him, telling him that they could still move forward, that they could rebuild, Haemon didn't know how to do that anymore. For the collector, the road ahead felt endless too. He had seen what the salt could do, how it could twist desires and feed on human weakness. He had been its steward, its unwitting servant, for too long, and now that it was gone, destroyed, at least for the time being, he had nothing left to guide him, no purpose other than to keep walking. They made camp by a river one evening, its waters dark and still. The fire crackled in front of them, its light flickering and casting shadows on their faces. The quiet hum of the world around them seemed so far removed from the chaos they had left behind. It was a kind of peace, but a peace that was laced with bitterness, with the ache of too many unanswered questions. Aemon sat across from the collector, staring into the fire. His gaze was distant, his mind clearly 1,000 miles away. The salt collector could feel the weight of his silence, and the weight of his own. "Do you ever wonder if it was meant to happen?" Aemon asked suddenly, his voice so quiet it almost seemed to disappear in the night air. The collector looked at him, surprised by the question. "Meant to happen?" he repeated, unsure of what Aemon was asking. Aemon Sipta's eyes were fixed on the fire, but there was a faint tremor in his voice as he spoke. "The salt, the way it came into our lives. Do you think we could have stopped it, or was it always going to happen? Were we just part of its story?" The collector paused, considering the question. He had thought about this often, wondered whether they had ever had a choice. Had the salt always been there, waiting to awaken, or had they brought it to life? And if they had brought it to life, had they done so unwittingly, or had something darker, more insidious, been pushing them all along? "I don't yet know," the collector admitted. "Maybe it was inevitable. Maybe we were just pieces in a much larger story than we could ever understand. Or maybe we could have stopped it. But at what point could we have stopped it, after it had taken so many lives? After Leora?" Aemon's face contorted slightly at the mention of his sister, but he didn't look up. He just kept staring into the fire, as though he were looking for some kind of answer in the flames. "Feels like we were all just waiting for it. For something to happen, and when it did, we didn't know what to do. It was like the salt was always there, pulling us, controlling us." The collector sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in the pit of his stomach. It was never just about the salt. It was about what we wanted, what we thought we could control, what we thought we could fix. Aemon finally looked up at him, his eyes dull with a mixture of pain and confusion. "And now what? Now that it sips over, what do we have left? What do I have left?" The collector studied him for a moment, watching the man who had once been full of so much energy, so much hope, now reduced to a shell of himself. "You have your life," he said softly. "You sat still here. That sips something." Eamon shook his head, his lips tight. "I don't feel like I have anything left." The collector looked away, unable to offer any better comfort. He understood Eamon's pain all too well. He had lost something too, though it was different. Eamon had lost his sister, his hope. The collector had lost his connection to something deeper. The salt had been a part of him, had shaped him, and now, without it, he felt lost, empty. "I don't know what comes next," the collector finally said, his voice low. "I don't know what we are supposed to do with the rest of our lives, but we can keep looking back. We have to move forward, one step at a time." Eamon didn't reply, but he nodded faintly. It wasn't much, just a small acknowledgement that the collector's words had reached him, but it was something. They sat in silence for a while longer, the sound of the river flowing softly beside them, the crackling of the fire the only noise between them. The weight of the night hung heavy, filled with the remnants of their shared grief, but also a strange sense of quiet understanding. Neither of them had the answers, neither of them knew what came next, but they were alive, and that in itself was something. As the fire began to die down, the collector felt the heavy pull of sleep tugging at him. His thoughts were still jumbled, still consumed by the events of the past, but he knew that he couldn't afford to linger there forever. They had come this far, and there was still more to face. The salt, though destroyed, had left its mark on everything it touched. And now, it was time to find a way to live with that mark. The days that followed felt like they were passing in slow motion. Eamon and the salt collector continued their journey, but it seemed that time had taken on a different quality, as if it were stretching out before them endlessly. The weight of their past hung over them like a cloud that refused to break, and the world around them felt muted, distant. The sun still rose and set, the river still flowed, but everything seemed far removed from the life they had once known. They moved through empty landscapes, fields of withered crops, forests, where the trees stood like silent sentinels, barren and lifeless. The world had a quiet, almost mournful quality to it now, as if it were grieving for the lives that had been lost, the villages that had been swallowed whole by the salt's hunger. The collector could feel it too. The world had changed, and so had they. Each evening they would set up camp, light a fire, and sit in silence. There was no more talk of hope, no more talk of redemption. The future was something they no longer believed in. It was too uncertain, too far away. For Eamon, the fire had long since gone out inside him. The man who had once fought so desperately to bring his sister back was now a shadow of the person he had been, his eyes hollow, his heart heavy with grief. The salt collector, too, had changed. The man who had once believed in the alchemy of life, who had sought to understand the elements, was now haunted by the power of the salt. He knew that it had been a part of him, and even though it had been destroyed, its influence would never leave him. It was in the air, in the very land they walked upon, and it was in them, in their bones, in their souls. The salt had taken something from them, something that could never be returned. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a pale golden light, the salt collector broke the silence. "We can't keep running," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Eamon didn't look up. His face was turned toward the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames, but there was no warmth in them. "What else is there to do?" he asked, his voice flat. "We can fix what's been broken. We can undo what's been done." The collector nodded, understanding the weight of Eamon's words. He, too, felt the crushing inevitability of it all, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they still had something to offer. They had survived the salt, had made it through the worst of it. That in itself had to mean something. "We may not be able to fix what's been broken," the collector said slowly, "but that doesn't mean we can try to make something new. We can erase what's happened, but we can choose what comes next. We still have a choice." Eamon turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward the collector, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, and for a long moment, the collector wasn't sure if he had reached Eamon, or if the weight of their grief was simply too heavy to bear. "What do you mean?" Eamon finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's left? After everything?" The collector took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something, anything, to hold on to. We can sit, change the past. We can sit, bring back the people we sit lost. But we sit, still here. We sit, still alive. And maybe that sit's enough. Maybe that sit's the start of something new. Eamon sits, eyes drop to the ground, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the world. I don't know if I can keep going, he murmured. Everything feels so empty. I know, the collector replied softly. I feel it too, but we have to move forward, one step at a time. We can sit, let the past consume us. We can sit, let it take everything. The air between them felt thick with the weight of the conversation, but there was something in the collector's words, something that cut through the numbness. Eamon didn't speak for a long time, but the collector could see the shift in his eyes, the faintest spark of something. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. The collector stood, his joints stiff, but there was a quiet resolve in the way he moved. We have to decide what we want from the rest of our lives, he said quietly, and whatever it is, we need to start walking toward it. Eamon didn't reply, but after a long moment he stood as well, his movements slow and reluctant, as if each step required a great effort. Together, they packed up their camp, the sound of rustling materials filling the quiet night air. The next few days passed in much the same way, silent, weighed down by the enormity of what had happened. But as they moved forward, there was a subtle shift. It wasn't much, but it was there. Eamon didn't speak often, but there were moments when the collector saw something in him, an inkling of the man he had once been. A part of him was still alive, still struggling to find a way through the wreckage, and the collector, though he felt the same gnawing emptiness, couldn't help but believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future out there for them. They continued walking, leaving the wreckage of the village far behind. Days turned into weeks, and with each step, the weight of their past seemed to lessen just a little. They still had no destination, no clear path forward, but they were moving, and that, for now, was enough. One morning, as they came upon a river, its water sparkling in the soft light of the rising sun, the collector stopped. For the first time in a long while, he felt the air around him shift, a subtle, quiet energy. The salt had taken so much, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken their ability to keep moving, to keep searching for something better. We keep moving, the collector said quietly, more to himself than to Eamon. That sip's all we can do. Eamon looked out at the river, his face a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something that had been buried beneath layers of grief and regret. Maybe moving is all we need right now, he said, his voice softer than it had been in days. The collector gave a small nod, feeling the truth of Eamon's words settle deep in his chest. For the first time since the salt had entered their lives, the future seemed like a distant possibility, something they might one day reach. The journey was far from over, but they had come this far together, and that, at least, was something. As the days wore on, the landscape around Eamon and the salt collector began to change. The desolation they had wandered through slowly started to give way to signs of life, tall grasses swaying in the breeze, birds flying overhead, and the occasional wildflower pushing through the cracks in the earth. The world, it seemed, was still alive, despite everything that had happened. The salt had taken much, but it had not taken the world entirely, and in that there was a strange, quiet comfort. Their journey took them through small villages, ones that still hummed with the simple rhythm of life, places where the memories of the salt's influence hadn't yet reached. In these villages, people went about their business as if the world was still turning, as it always had, and in a way, it was. The salt had consumed only one village, but there was something in the air of these places that felt different, a subtle awareness that the world had changed, and perhaps they were just too far from the wreckage to notice. Eamon, as quiet as ever, began to pick up small tasks along the way, helping farmers with harvests, mending a broken fence, or simply offering a smile to someone in need. It wasn't much, but it was something. The salt collector noticed these moments, the quiet determination in Eamon's actions. It was as though he was trying to find a way to be part of the world again, to make up for the devastation, even in small, quiet acts. For the collector, these moments were harder to embrace. His role in the events that had unfolded, the way he had led the village toward its destruction, The way he had been complicit in the salt spread still gnawed at him. He often found himself staring out over the horizon, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. It was as if the salt's hunger had left a scar on his soul that could never heal, and though he kept moving forward, he knew that the peace they had now was fragile. One misstep, one wrong turn, and everything could come crumbling down again. Still, there was something in the way Eamon was starting to re-enter the world that gave the collector some hope. Perhaps there was more to life than simply surviving. Perhaps, even after everything, there was still a chance for something new, something better. One evening, as they made camp by the edge of a quiet lake, the collector sat by the fire, his mind restless. The firelight flickered in the reflection of the water, and he could hear the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. And yet, despite the tranquility of the moment, the collector couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being followed, that the salt's influence was still lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. He had never shared his fears with Eamon, had never admitted to the part of him that believed the salt might not be truly gone, but it was always there, a quiet fear that gnawed at the back of his mind. Eamon, as if sensing the shift in the air, sat down beside him, his eyes lingering on the flames. "You sit been quiet lately," he said, his voice low. "I thought maybe you sit given up too." The collector turned to face him, surprised by the words. He had never expected Eamon to notice, let alone speak about it. "I haven't it given up," the collector said quietly, his eyes lingering on the fire. "I just sometimes wonder if there sips anything left to fight for. The salt took so much, and now I don't sit know what we sips are supposed to do with what sips are left." Eamon didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. For a long moment, there was only the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of the night around them. Finally, Eamon spoke again, his voice gentle but steady. "Maybe we don't need to fight anymore," he said. "Maybe we just need to live." The collector looked at him, his brow furrowing slightly. "Live?" Eamon nodded, his face still etched with the weariness of everything they had been through. "We can sit change what happened, we can sit bring back what we lost, but we can choose what comes next. We can choose to keep moving forward." The collector was silent for a moment, his mind turning over Eamon's words. It wasn't a solution, not really, but it was a start. A new kind of freedom, perhaps. A freedom not from the past, but in spite of it. "We sit will never escape the past," the collector said, his voice rough. "The salt, the village, it sips all part of us now. But maybe it sips not about escaping. Maybe it sips about living with it." Eamon Six's expression softened, a faint flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Exactly. We sit been running for so long. Maybe it sits time we stopped." The collector nodded, feeling something stirs inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. The road ahead might be uncertain, but perhaps they didn't need to know the way. Perhaps they just needed to keep walking. "We till keep moving," the collector said quietly, the words slipping from him like a vow. "We till keep walking, one step at a time." Eamon gave him a small, faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The fire crackled in the silence between them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the salt collector felt the weight of the world lift, just a little. The past was still there, still looming over them, but perhaps it didn't need to define them. Maybe for the first time in their lives, they could start anew. As the fire burned low and the stars blinked down at them from above, the two of them sat in quiet companionship, both knowing that the journey ahead would be long and uncertain. But at least for tonight, they had peace. For tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. The days passed more easily now, though they were still fraught with the heavy undercurrent of what had happened. Eamon and the collector had found a rhythm to their journey, even if that rhythm was uncertain. Each morning they awoke to the quiet of the world, and each night they fell asleep beneath a canopy of stars that seemed to promise them nothing more than the chance to try again. They kept moving, one step at a time, away from the past and toward a future that felt as ambiguous as the landscape that stretched before them. They reached new villages, new towns, places where people still lived their lives with the simplicity that the collector remembered from his youth. He watched these people with a strange mixture of envy and awe. They carried on, unfazed by the weight of the world, by the unspoken knowledge that their lives too could be upended by forces far beyond their control. As time went on, the collector began to understand something important. They would never be able to outrun the past, nor would they be able to forget what had happened. The salt had changed them. It had marked them in ways that could never be undone, but that didn't mean they had to let it define them. They had the choice, just as Eamon had said, to live in spite of it. There were moments when the collector still felt the pull of the salt, that faint whisper in the back of his mind that promised power, understanding, and certainty. But those moments grew less frequent, and when they came, he could push them aside, remembering that the salt's promises had always come at too high a cost. Eamon, too, was finding his way. The pain of losing Leora, of losing the village, still clung to him like a shadow. But there were flashes of the man he had once been, the hope, the determination, the willingness to fight for what was right. He hadn't lost those parts of himself entirely. They were still there, just buried deep beneath the weight of grief. And with every passing day, they began to emerge again, bit by bit, as he began to find meaning in the small acts of life, the mundane moments that were so easily overlooked in a world turned upside down. One evening, after they had made camp by a winding river, the salt collector found himself staring at the water. It was a clear, calm night, the sky full of stars, and the river's surface mirrored the moonlight perfectly. The air was cool, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves of the trees that surrounded them. It was a peaceful scene, almost too peaceful, given everything they had been through, and yet it was the first time in a long while that the collector felt something like peace settle in his chest. Eamon sat beside him, his face calm, but his eyes were distant. They had been quiet for a while, but this time there was a kind of contentment between them, something unspoken but understood. "You ever think about the village?" Eamon asked quietly, breaking the silence. "I mean, I know it's Sip's gone, but sometimes it feels like I can still hear the voices, still see the people, and then I remember that Sip's not there anymore, that none of it is there." The collector glanced at him, his eyes soft. "I think about it every day," he said, his voice low. "I think about the people we couldn't save. I think about the way we failed them, and I think about the salt, the way it twisted everything. But I also know something else now." Eamon turned to look at him, his brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" The collector took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. "I know that no matter how much we want to, we can change the past. We can go back, but we can keep moving forward. We can choose what we do now, and maybe that Sip's enough." Eamon considered this for a moment, his eyes distant. "Yeah, maybe. I don't know if I will ever be able to truly move on from it all, but maybe I don't need to. Maybe, like you said, I just need to keep moving forward." The collector nodded, turning his gaze back to the river. "Sit's all we can do, one step at a time, and maybe in the end, that Sip's enough." Eamon sat in silence for a while, his eyes focused on the river. The wind rustled through the trees, and the faint sound of the water flowing gently downstream filled the space between them. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but there was a comfort in the silence, a shared understanding that though they had both been scarred by the salt, they were still alive, they were still here. As the night wore on, and the fire burned down to embers, the collector felt a strange kind of peace settle over him. It wasn't a peace that came from forgetting, or from pretending the past hadn't happened. No, this peace came from acceptance, from knowing that they could not undo what had been done, but they could choose how they moved forward. The salt had taken so much, but it hadn't taken everything. They still had their lives, their choices, and the road ahead. In the distance, the sound of the river's flow seemed to grow louder, as if the world was reminding them that life was still moving forward, no matter how they felt. The collector closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the quiet of the night to wash over him, and when he opened them again, he saw something in Eamon's face that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of something more. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was simply the knowledge that they had survived. Either way, it was enough. The salt had taken so much, but it hadn't taken everything. And as the night stretched on, the collector and Eamon sat together by the river, knowing that, for the first time in a long time, they had found a way to live with the scars. The days blurred into one another as they travelled, and though the journey remained long, there was a quiet rhythm to it now. Eamon and the Collector had found a tentative peace, one built not on forgetting the past, but on accepting it, living with it. The salt had taken so much, but it had not taken everything, and as each day passed, they both grew more accustomed to the weight of their losses. Eamon began to speak more about his memories of the village, of his sister Leora, and even of moments before the salt had come into their lives. It was slow, but with every conversation, there was something healing, something that began to mend the fractures of his soul. The Collector, too, began to open up more, though his words were fewer. His mind often wandered to the past, to the moments when he had been the one to lead the village toward the salt's allure. But with Eamon by his side, he began to understand the true meaning of survival, not as something to escape from, but as something to endure. They crossed mountains, fields, and rivers. The land seemed endless, stretching out before them like a canvas, the world still very much alive despite what they had been through. They stopped in small villages now and again, helping when they could, though always with the knowledge that they were strangers here. They did not belong. The salt, the grief, the loss, it still lingered with them always. One day, as they came upon a small town tucked away in a valley, something changed. They were just passing through, having spent the previous night at a camp by the river, when they heard the sound of music drifting from a nearby square. It was soft at first, but the closer they got, the clearer it became. People were gathered, laughing, dancing, and celebrating. It was a festival, the Collector realized as they walked toward the square, a celebration of the harvest, of life itself. For a moment he hesitated. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting from this place. But it wasn't this, a group of strangers coming together, not in mourning, but in celebration. It felt out of place. How could these people, who had no idea what they had been through, be so joyful? Eamon, too, seemed unsure, his face darkening as he glanced at the people dancing, their faces bright and full of life. But then, without a word, he took a step forward. There was no sign of the deep pain that had clouded his eyes for so long. The small flicker of life that had been hiding within him seemed to catch fire, and before the Collector could stop him, Eamon made his way toward the square. "Come on," Eamon called over his shoulder, his voice lighter than it had been in days. The Collector was taken aback. Join them, after everything? But he found himself following anyway, his feet moving almost on their own. He could feel the pull of the crowd, the energy, the sound of laughter rising in the air. It was intoxicating, almost surreal. How could people be this carefree? Didn't they understand the weight of the world? Didn't they know that salt had consumed lives, torn villages apart? But as he stepped into the center of the square, the warmth of the firelight, the sounds of the music, and the open faces of the villagers surrounded him. It was as if for a moment, the weight of the salt, the grief, the loss, they all faded. For the first time in a long while, he let himself feel something else. He allowed himself to feel the joy that was so foreign to him now. A woman, laughing, caught sight of him and waved, pulling him into the circle. She was young, her hair dark and wild, her eyes filled with kindness. "Come dance," she called to him. "Join us." Eamon was already dancing, his feet moving in time with the music. He looked back at the Collector, a mischievous grin on his face. "It sits not so bad," he said. "You should try it, for once." For a moment the Collector hesitated. He felt a part of himself pull away, caught between the memories of loss and the desire to join in this simple human joy. But something in him shifted. The salt had taken so much, but it hadn't taken his ability to choose. With a slow, deliberate movement, the Collector stepped into the circle, allowing the music to pull him in. It felt foreign at first, awkward even, but as the rhythm worked its way into his bones, he began to move with the others. The villagers cheered, and the world seemed, for just a moment, to right itself. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. The music filled the air, the sound of feet stomping on the earth, the rhythm of joy that had survived despite everything. The salt had taken, yes, but this was life, and it was still there, in every note of the music, in every step they took. Eamon grinned at the Collector. his eyes alight with something the collector hadn't seen in him for so long. A glimmer of hope, of light, the fire, the people, the laughter. It was all so ordinary, so simple, but it was enough. By the time the music slowed, the sky was darker, the stars bright above them. The villagers were still laughing, still dancing, but Eamon and the collector had stepped aside, sitting by the fire. Their faces were flushed, their spirits lifted by the sheer force of the moment. The past, though it lingered, seemed a little further away now. "Maybe we can still find moments like this," Eamon said quietly, his eyes staring into the fire, his voice softer than it had been in days. The collector nodded slowly, watching the flames dance. "Maybe we can." The night stretched on, and for the first time in a long time, the collector allowed himself to believe that perhaps there was a future for them after all. It wasn't the future they had once dreamed of. No, but it was a future nonetheless, and it was one they could still shape, one step at a time. They had come so far, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, for tonight they had found something they hadn't had in a long time. A sense of belonging, a sense of life. And in that, there was something to hold on to. The days that followed the festival were quieter, but in a way, they carried more weight. The energy from the night of dancing, the laughter, and the fleeting moments of joy still lingered in the air like a delicate perfume. Eamon and the collector continued their journey, but now there was a subtle difference in their steps. There was a lightness to them, not in the way that could erase the past, but in the way that they allowed themselves to live within the present. The past still haunted them, but they had found a moment of respite, and that, for now, was enough. The road ahead still stretched far before them, uncertain, unmarked, and unforgiving. They still had no clear destination, no grand purpose or mission to drive them forward, but they had each other, and they had the ability to choose how they moved forward, one step at a time. As they made their way through the countryside, they began to feel the weight of their journey in their bones. The path was long, but the moments of clarity, the moments of peace, had begun to outnumber the darker ones. They still had the memories of the salt, the devastation, the loss, but they were learning to live with it. The salt had not taken everything, and that small, quiet fact was beginning to mean more than they had ever imagined. They passed through villages that seemed to flourish in the wake of hardship, small towns where people lived simple lives. Children ran through fields, and farmers worked the land. The contrast was stark, but the collector had learned to appreciate it. Life, no matter how fragile, would always find a way to persist. The salt's hunger could not consume everything, and in these quiet villages the proof was before them. One morning, as they rested by a riverbank, the collector found himself staring at the water again. The river, winding and calm, seemed to carry everything with it. It didn't stop for anyone. It didn't wait. It simply moved forward, onward, relentlessly. And yet, in that relentless movement, it also carried life, fish, plants, birds, all part of a larger system that thrived in its wake. For the first time in what felt like forever, the collector felt something akin to hope. The salt had come, it had destroyed, it had taken, but it had not taken everything. There were still fragments left. The laughter, the moments of connection, the chance to rebuild, even if only piece by piece. There was still life, even in the wake of destruction. "You know," Eamon's set voice broke through his thoughts. "I never thought I to be here again, not like this, after everything." The collector turned his gaze to him, surprised. Eamon's voice was soft, but there was a weight behind it, a realization that the journey they had been on, no matter how painful, had led them to a place they could not have imagined when they had first set out. "I didn't either," the collector said. "But sometimes the only way out is through." Eamon nodded, his expression distant but thoughtful. "Whore. I'm still not sure where this road ends, but maybe that sip's okay. Maybe I sipped am finally starting to understand that it doesn't matter, we can still choose." The collector smiled faintly, his heart lightening with the truth of Eamon Sip's words. "Exactly. We don't have to know what happens next. We just have to live with it, step by step." Eamon looked out over the river, his gaze far off. "I don't know if I'll ever stop grieving. I don't know if I'll ever stop missing Leora." The collector didn't answer right away, his mind turning over Eamon's words. Grief was a weight that didn't lift easily, especially when it was tied to something so powerful. Losing a loved one to the salt was a wound that would never fully heal, but perhaps, just perhaps, there would come a time when the grief wouldn't define them. There would come a time when the memory of Leora and the pain of losing her could be something to carry, rather than something that consumed. You don't have to stop grieving, the collector finally said, but you don't have to let it control you either. Set's eyes flickered over to him, and for the first time in a long while, the collector saw something resembling peace settle into his features. I think I sipped, and finally starting to believe that. The river continued to flow in front of them, its waters calm and steady, but moving, always moving. And for the first time in a long time, the collector could see that, just as the river moved forward without looking back, so could they. They sat in quiet contemplation for a while longer, their thoughts lingering in the spaces between them, but neither of them felt the need to speak. They had come so far, and though they still carried the weight of their past with them, they also carried the understanding that they could keep going. The salt had taken a part of them, more than one part, in truth, but it had not taken everything. After a time, they rose from the bank, gathering their belongings and preparing to continue their journey. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and the air had begun to cool. But for the first time in a long while, the collector didn't feel the oppressive weight of the past following them. They were moving, yes, but they were also living, choosing what came next. As they walked, the collector couldn't help but glance at Eamon, who was walking just a few paces ahead, his head lifted slightly, his shoulders straighter than they had been in a long time. He was still weighed down by his loss, by his grief, but there was something different in him now, something that was beginning to move forward, even if it was only one small step at a time. They didn't know what awaited them. They didn't know what their future held, but they were still here. They were still alive, and that, in itself, was something worth holding on to. The days continued to pass in quiet succession, one after another, and with each step they took, it became easier to breathe. Eamon and the collector had settled into a new rhythm, one born not of purpose or destination, but of the slow, steady process of living with the past. They no longer rushed, no longer tried to outrun their grief or their memories. Instead, they embraced the quiet, allowing the stillness of the world around them to heal what it could. Though they were still haunted by the salt, the weight of it didn't feel as suffocating anymore. It didn't consume them in the same way it had at the beginning of their journey. They had learned, slowly and painfully, that life could still be lived in the shadows of loss, and that, perhaps, was enough. They arrived at a small town, one crisp autumn evening. The streets were narrow and cobblestone, the buildings old and weathered by time. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and the quiet chatter of people as they finished their day's work. It was nothing like the village they had once known, and yet there was something familiar about it, a sense of community, of life continuing on, even in the face of hardship. As they passed through the town square, they noticed a group of children playing in the fading light, their laughter ringing out like a melody in the cool air. Eamon paused for a moment, his eyes watching the children as they chased each other through the square, their energy unburdened by the weight of the world. For a moment, the collector thought he saw something shift in Eamon's expression, something fragile but real. Maybe it was a spark of the man he used to be, the man who had once believed in saving others, who had once fought with everything he had to protect the ones he loved. They found a place to stay in a small inn near the center of town. The building was simple but warm, and the fire in the hearth flickered brightly in the common room. The innkeeper, a woman with kind eyes, greeted them with a smile and offered them a meal, simple but satisfying. As they sat by the fire that evening, the warmth from the flames spreading through the room, the collector found himself lost in thought. His mind kept returning to the same question that had plagued him for so long. What now? What came after the destruction of the salt? What came after everything they had lost? But as the evening passed, he realized that the question wasn't so important anymore. They didn't have to have all the answers. They didn't have to know what their future would look like. They simply had to keep moving forward. Eamon sat across from him, his face relaxed for once, a small but genuine smile on his lips as he spoke to the innkeeper. The woman had offered them a place to stay without question, without hesitation, and for a brief moment, the collector could almost forget the past, almost forget the weight they both carried. They were just two men, sitting by a fire, sharing a meal, like any other travellers on the road. After a while, the innkeeper retired to her quarters, leaving them alone by the fire. Eamon, looking slightly more at ease than he had in a long time, stretched out in his chair and let out a sigh. "You know," he said quietly, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think that moving on meant forgetting everything, that if I just put it all behind me, the pain would go away. But it doesn't set work like that, does it?" The collector leaned back in his chair, studying the fire. "No, it doesn't set. You can seek to outrun the past, but you can learn to live with it." Eamon nodded, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "I don't set know if I set'll ever stop grieving. I don't set know if I set'll ever stop missing Leora, but maybe I don't set have to. Maybe it sets enough to just—" The collector looked at him, his gaze softening. "It is. It sits enough." The room was quiet for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Outside, the night air was cool and still, and the world felt at peace. For the first time in a long time, the collector allowed himself to simply be, to exist without the constant pressure of what had happened, without the weight of the salt, the grief, the destruction. For this moment, there was peace. As the fire burned low, the collector stood and stretched, the movement stiff but purposeful. "I think we should rest. We earned it." Eamon didn't argue. Instead, he nodded, standing up as well. They walked upstairs to their separate rooms, and as the collector lay in bed, the quiet of the night settling around him, he thought about the road ahead. It was still unclear, still uncertain, but he no longer feared it. They were still here. And as long as they had each other, as long as they kept moving forward, they would find their way. The next morning, they awoke to the sound of birds singing outside, the first light of dawn creeping through the window. The town was quiet, the world still holding its breath before the start of a new day. They shared a simple breakfast before setting out again. No grand farewell, no promises of what the future would bring, just two men walking down the road together, side by side. They had learned something on this journey. They had learned that the past couldn't be undone, that the salt had taken much, but not everything. They had learned that living meant moving forward, even when the road was uncertain, even when the future was unclear. They kept walking, and that was enough. Sweet dreams.